All right, folks, it's great to have you with us today. My name's Tony Morgan. I'm with the Unstuck Group, and before we dive into the content, I do want to introduce you to the folks joining us on today's panel. Let me begin with William Vanderbloemen. We're grateful to have the Vanderbloemen Search Group partnering with us on this research and the report that's being generated, and today's event as well. William is a good friend of mine. We've known each other for several years, and his search firm, it's one of our strategic partners, and they're one of our partners because we believe in what they do to help churches find their leaders in multiple roles, senior pastors, executive pastors, all leadership positions, helping all size churches across the country. And William, it's just great to have you with us today.
Thanks so much, Tony. Always fun to work with you.
A couple of other people from the Unstuck Group we will be having with us today Ryan Steigel. Ryan is our strategic analyst. He's the numbers guy. He's kind of the brains behind the research we're doing at the Unstuck Group, and it really helped spearhead what we're doing currently with the staffing and structure research. And Ryan will be helping navigate our conversation today. Ryan, good to have you with us.
Glad to be here. Looking forward to it.
And finally, from our team, Sarah Bauma is one of our ministry consultants. She specializes in staffing and structure reviews for our team. Sarah and I go way back to our ministry days together at Granger Community Church. But after that, Sarah went on then to work in corporate HR. She worked with Kellogg Corporation. So Special K, that's right up your alley, Sarah?
Absolutely, yes. Thanks, Tony.
All right, it's good to have you as well. So we're excited to today reveal for the first time some of the findings from our Next Level Teams research, really diving in to looking at what's happening in churches across the country when it comes to staffing and structure. And we were pleasantly surprised at the response, the number of folks that completed the survey. In fact, Ryan, I'm going to kind of turn it over to you just to give a little background about how we pulled the data together, a little bit about the churches that participated.
Sure. So a few months ago, we were asking ourselves the question, hey, what are churches doing to develop great staff teams? And we were thinking, hey, what are the ins and outs of that? And so we started asking. And so we launched this survey several months ago in partnership with Vanderbloemen Search Group and Unstuck. And we were shocked to have 628 churches respond. We had 628 paid staff members, all of them paid, and on staff to church, respond to this survey about how their team is built, how they're structured, and how they're led. Even more surprisingly, 3 out of 4 of the individuals who responded were on the senior leadership team of their church. So these are people who have a very good perspective of how their church is operating and how their staff is built and how it's being led. And we dug into the data, saw some trends, and we're excited to talk through today what we're seeing in church world and what we're seeing churches do to develop great teams and some corrections that may need to be made along the way as well. So some good looking stuff in there.
That's great. Well, we're going to dive right into the content, though. But before we do that, let me give you a couple of pointers on how we're going to navigate the conversation today. First of all, we are recording this. And so at the conclusion of this webinar, we'll make sure to share the link so that you can access this later or share it with somebody else on your team. Secondly, at the end of our time together, we'll be responding to questions. And if you haven't submitted a question yet, you can do that. There's a link down at the bottom of your screen, Q&A link, and feel free to submit that. And we'll try to respond to as many questions as we can at the end of our time together. Now, Ryan, in a moment, I'm just going to turn it over to you. But when we looked at the research, the data that came in, it helped us identify 5 critical insights that kind of jumped out from the data that we collected. And so I'm going to let you just dive in, share some of those insights, and just pull Sarah and William into the conversation as well as we go.
Sure thing. So like you said, there were 5 kind of major insights, and we've got a report we'll be releasing next week full of a lot of other different things that we found. But 5 major things that stood out to us, we're going to kind of walk through today and share those with everyone and have some dialogue around them. I'll throw some slides up as we go just to kind of help make sense of the data. But the first thing that we saw as we were analyzing this, one of the biggest things that jumped out to us are what we're calling 3 critical aspects of an effective senior leadership team. So these were 3 kind of characteristics of senior leadership teams that we saw making a significant impact. We saw churches using these 3 aspects growing 70% faster than the average church, which was phenomenal to us. And as you see here, those 3 aspects are this. The first one is that everyone on the senior leadership team, or that highest ranking team in the organization, everyone has a distinct role with clear responsibilities and measurable goals. So there's no confusion about who's doing what in the organization or who's leading what. Everybody on the senior leadership team has very clear responsibilities and very clear goals by which they're being measured. And the second thing we saw there is that there's a clear strategy that senior leadership team is implementing throughout the entire organization. So there's not just clarity at the top of the organization, but there's a clear strategy or a clear way that they're doing ministry that's being implemented throughout every area of that organization. And the third piece there is that every program and ministry ultimately connects to a member of the senior leadership team. So there's none of these island ministries, or sometimes I call them rogue ministries, things that have kind of just existed over the years and no one really takes ownership of. But everything that the church is doing ultimately through reporting relationships connects to a senior leadership or a member of the senior leadership team. And like we said before, it has a phenomenal effect. Churches that have all 3 of these characteristics on their senior leadership team, they're growing by 17% on average, where the average church that participated in this survey was growing by 10%. So we thought that was phenomenal. And William, I know you've worked with a number of senior leadership teams along the way. Does this shock you? Does it surprise you? What makes sense in this for you from what you've seen?
I think the biggest takeaway that jumps out at me is the fact that everybody on the leadership team is engaged with the rest of their employees. If you go into the corporate world, which we take a lot of cues from and actually work with some for-profit companies that are faith-based, you'll find that the hot topic among employee retention right now is employee engagement. Recent Harvard Business Review study, they sampled several hundred CEOs and asked them, how important do you think it is that your employees are engaged in the workplace? And then somewhere between 70 and 72% of them said it is of ultimate importance. Then when you turn around and ask them, same group, say, so how many of you think your employees are engaged? It's about 24%. So trying to find ways to get people engaged is pretty key in any organization, but particularly in churches, where for the longest time, church could just take for granted that people would show up. Church would take for granted that Sunday was their day. Now you've got the bulk of young families, which are the growth engine of the church. The bulk of them, like 75%, are dual income households that have maybe one day a week together. And on that one day a week, now there's a soccer league on Sunday morning. And the competition for time is like never before. So churches have had to figure out, we're either going to have to be lean and innovative or just resign ourselves to irrelevance. And so I think when churches start behaving with clear measurable goals, when everyone owns a ministry, when you have a meeting, not just to have a meeting, but to say who owns it, when we come back, who's going to provide a solution path, just typical good, solid business practices that entrepreneurial businesses have to do. When you start to see that in churches, it's amazing how you don't have to plan for growth, just plan for health, and then healthy things will grow.
That's fantastic. That's I love the tie-in between what we've seen in the corporate world, what we're seeing necessary now in church leadership. We'll jump to the second finding here. Tony, this is one, it kind of supports something that you've been writing about for a while that I think a lot of church leaders have found shocking. In fact, there's been a lot of dialogue about how does that make sense? So it was interesting to see it in the data as we worked with these 600 churches. It's this idea that fast-growing churches are utilizing fewer staff. That seems backwards, but I'll show this real quick. Fast-growing churches are utilizing fewer staff. And what we saw was this. We saw that churches with a staff team that is smaller than 1% of the congregation size are growing more than twice as fast as churches with a larger staff. So just to break that down, that idea of a staff team that's smaller than 1% of the congregation size, that's saying that there's no more than one full-time staff member for every 100 people in the church. And the idea there is that churches that are operating at that level of efficiency or with that size of a team or smaller are actually growing twice as fast as churches that are staffing with more than one staff member per 100 people in that church. So we see churches with just that staff member or staff ratio of 1 to 100, they're growing by 17% on average, where churches that have a larger staff than that are growing by just 8%. So even growing half as quickly as that. So again, it kind of doesn't make sense, and it sounds counterintuitive, Tony. A lot of organizations, a lot of churches actually will talk about staffing ahead of growth, but this almost suggests a little bit different thought process there. So what have you seen? What's it look like?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just explain to make sure that we have apples to apples across all churches. When we look at staffing ratios compared to attendance, we're looking at all staff, pastors, ministry staff, administrative support staff, custodians, on down the line. And we try to determine what are the full-time equivalents. So factoring in all the part-time staff, how many equivalent full-time staff does that get us to? And as the data points to, Ryan, we really trying to encourage churches to try to only have one full-time equivalent staff member for every 100 people in attendance. And for some people listening in today, you're thinking, wow, let's hire some more staff because we're running lean. But for most churches that are listening in today, you're probably thinking, I can't imagine having that few staff. And I think it points to a couple of key things that we find in these churches that are running leaner and therefore experiencing faster growth is when they're hiring fewer staff, they're more intentional about the staff they're hiring. In other words, they're making sure with limited financial resources and limited ability to pay people to be on our ministry staff team, we're only going to get the best, the folks that really can deliver. They're high capacity leaders. They know how to make things happen, and primarily making things happen through other people. And that's the second key fact is these churches that are running lean with their staffing, many times we're finding from previous research are also very effective when it comes to mobilizing volunteers. Mm-hmm. And what we know from our previous research too is when people volunteer, they're more likely to show up, which makes sense because they're on a schedule, they're committed. They're more likely to invite their friends. Frankly, even if you look at their giving patterns, the people that are serving in ministry will give more than the people that are just attending or members or even plugged into a small group or a Sunday school class. And I think it just makes sense. The people that really own the ministry and they're reflecting that through their time investment and their money investment, those are the folks that are really helping you get ministry done and reach more people for Jesus. And as a result of that, it doesn't surprise me that the churches that are lean in their staffing and really then trying to get ministry done through volunteers are also growing twice as fast. That's very encouraging.
That's great. It's great to hear it. It's that reminder sometimes for me that sometimes when we hire staff, we replace volunteers unintentionally. We block them out from serving. So
that's right.
I think that's huge. So we're kind of working through these 5 major findings from the Next Level Teams report. And the third one focuses in on this idea of leadership development, which is a topic that sometimes gets lost sometimes in ministry. But here's what we saw in regard to leadership development trends. We saw that when churches are using 3 specific key components to develop their staff, they're also growing twice as fast as the average church. And here's what those 3 components look like, these 3 key components to staff leadership development. The first one is that there is an intentional leadership development strategy. So leadership development goes from being just a buzzword, something that gets talked about, to actually having a real plan behind it. And the church has a way or a structure or a framework by which they're developing their staff. The second piece there is a financial investment in staff development. So literally they're putting their money where their mouth is, right? They're investing in staff development, whether it be through classes, through conferences, through groups, whatever it may be, to provide staff development. They're financially investing in that. And the last piece is something that I think gets missed sometimes as well, and there's a specific person who's responsible for developing leaders. So again, it's not just something that's talked about. It's not just something that there's a plan for. It's not just something that's being spent on, but there is someone, an individual who owns leadership development across the staff. And what we saw here is that churches with all 3 of those key components are growing by 22% a year on average, right? Where the average church is growing by just 10%. Another interesting piece of this is that when a church has just any 2 of those 3 key components, you see no significant benefit there. You see just that average 10% growth across the board when churches are utilizing any 2 of those 3. But there's something about the combination of those 3 things, the strategy, a financial investment, and a specific person owning leadership development that leads to a significant difference. So, Sarah, I know you've worked with a number of churches on staff development and putting together a plan for that, as well as in the corporate world. What's that say to you? What do you see in that?
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. The first thing that it's just really a great reminder is that it's absolutely vital for us to both attract as well as retain really key high capacity staff is to make sure that we do have a leadership development strategy in place. People want to know that they're going to be invested in not only initially, but over the course of their entire year. Often, if we think back to even Tony's comments around the staff numbers and the leanness that we really see as really catapulting growth in churches, one of the things we notice is that there's not a lot of opportunity oftentimes for upward advancement. And so we have to look for ways to grow people as leaders, both in their technical competence, the different areas of ministry that they're invested in, and also their leadership capacity if we're going to really encourage them to be growing their career. And if your church is going to be a place where they say, gosh, I can see myself staying here for the long term. This is also a great opportunity for us to think about leadership development in terms of equipping our staff teams to really not just lead ministry, but to lead volunteers and to lead volunteer teams so that our volunteers are invested. They're seeing the connection to the vision. They're seeing the overall connection to our strategy as a church. And so then as we've also already mentioned, they're more engaged from a giving perspective, inviting their friends and really participating in the life of the church. And then, as we know, people are meeting Jesus, more people are growing in their walks with him, and ultimately that's what we want to be about. The great thing about this is that, as Ryan noted, you do have to have all three pieces in combination, but it's something that you can look at, and I think that the beginning of the year is a great time to be reflective of what are we going to do with our staff over the next 12 months? How are we going to be intentional about being great stewards with the people that we've been given, the gifts that they have, as well as the finances that we want to invest in them? So again, with that combination being key, the way that I think that you should think about applying this in your church is to think first about who should be accountable for spearheading this effort? How do you want to move this ahead from an SLT perspective? And look at it as an opportunity for your emerging leaders as well, as an opportunity for them to grow their capacity. Once you've picked a leader, again, you need to have more than just good intentions. You need a plan that's specific, that's measurable, where you've got some clear goals and benchmarks in mind so that it's not just one random conference here, one class that someone might take there, but what's your overall approach and what's your strategy around leadership development, and how do the different components that you want to execute on your staff really fit into that? Once you've got that plan, I would encourage you to just document, to say, when's it going to happen? How do we put it on the calendar so that we can really be intentional about how it's getting done? The other piece that I would note is that this is a great area where you can think beyond your staff team and think to your key volunteers as well. So whatever leadership strategy and whatever pieces you have in place for your staff team, you can also think about how can you invest in your volunteer leads as well. Now the caution there is certainly to make sure, and I think that the thing that considering our volunteers does is just to check for all of us as full-time people who are in ministry, is knowing that everyone has a family, they have responsibilities, they have typically a job outside of the church. So how do we really make a valuable investment of their time so that it's something that people will look forward to, that they'll feel equipped and not burdened by whatever you're providing from a leadership development standpoint?
That's awesome. That's great. Yeah, there's a theme in all of this, I think, through several of these points that point to that topic of staff engagement and keeping employees engaged. And you hit that really, really well there, which leads us kind of to our fourth finding as we work through, again, these 5 major findings from our Next Level Teams research report. The next finding we have here, number 4, again, goes to what you're talking about, Sarah, as far as staff engagement. It talks about 2 things that every staff member needs you as their leader to make clear for them, right? Every staff member needs clarity on 2 things that sometimes gets lost in ministry. In churches providing these 2 areas of clarity. They're growing 40% faster than the average church. And those 2 things are this: it's clear job responsibilities and wins, right? Everybody understands exactly what they're supposed to be focused on and what a ministry win is for them. But then also the second piece, which often gets lost, is clear measurable goals, right? Everyone knows not just what they're focused on, but how they're being evaluated, what they're being measured by. Churches providing that clarity, again, they're growing 40% faster than the average church. And Sarah, again, I would love to hear your insights on that. What's that mean for the average church when they're looking at providing clarity and keeping employees engaged?
Sure, and this is one area that if I've been out to your church in the past year, you know that I'm really passionate about. So often we find that people don't understand what a win looks like for their position. And that can be something that very quickly is frustrating when individuals and your staff teams, and then consequently your volunteer teams, really don't know what's expected of them. So what's really necessary in this area is first to have clear job responsibilities and a clear job description for people. And when you're looking at a new hire, this is a great opportunity to really assess What do we want that person to do? What are the key areas of ministry that they're accountable for? What are they going to be getting it done? And also be thinking about how they're getting it done. The third component to that, beyond the what and the how, is really the why. So again, making sure that all of the job responsibilities, similar to the ministries we talked about in the first point, making sure that everything ties back to your mission, vision, and strategy of the church. So that as people are looking at their job description, as people are looking at their responsibilities, they're saying, gosh, I see how this is going to further our mission. I see how I'm going to be impacting the kingdom for this. And once you have people who can really embrace that, it's very empowering to see that. And the power that they have for the volunteers who are serving under them is just multiplied at that point because they're catching that vision. They're really invested in that. This is also a great opportunity to ensure, as you're setting up, making sure that the gifts and the personality, the style, the strengths of each individual person is really matching up what they're being called to do and what's in their job description and what their responsibilities are. You know, we all know there are going to be pieces of our jobs that aren't our favorite, that when we see it on the calendar, we think, oh, that's not exactly matching my wiring or my gifting. However, a bulk of what people on your staff team are doing should be aligned to their strengths and the way that God has gifted them. I think that's one of the great things about working in a church body, is just to see how God brings people with diverse skills and talents and personalities all together to really serve, which can reflect the diversity of your community and really strengthens your ability to reach your community and help people grow in their walk with Christ. The other piece that I think is really key about this is making sure that you have defined reporting relationships. Often we'll go in and work with churches where people aren't really sure who they're reporting to. Is it the lead pastor? Is it a ministry director or leader? And then it can be something where it's really conflicting in terms of where people are getting their direction. So once you have those clear reporting relationships, you can make sure that people are being provided with clear responsibilities as well. The other piece that I think is important to keep in mind, and again, with this being January, it's a great time of year to look at this and to think through what you're going to be doing this year with your staff, is to establish some kind of an annual cycle where you can revisit those responsibilities, those accountabilities every year. To every year say, what's a win look like for my position and for my area of ministry? We know that often as our churches grow, or someone well-meaning might suggest a new ministry, a new opportunity. You might see something kind of bubbling up in your congregation, that those job descriptions, those responsibilities can creep. I would urge you to take caution in that, and annually might be a great opportunity to just revisit and say, okay, what are the core pieces of this job and how are we advancing our ministry through this? Once you establish those expectations, people know how they can exceed it. They can see what's personally important to them, and hopefully are working on pieces that they're really passionate about, which again is going to continue to empower them, engage them, and move our missions forward. So in terms of application, I think this is a great opportunity to just get a cycle going, put something on the calendar. Make sure at the beginning of the year you're kicking off with clear wins for the year. Perhaps establish a mid-year check-in and a year-end where each of your employees has an opportunity to contribute how they feel that they've done against the expectations. And then you as a lead, or as the manager or a lead pastor, has an opportunity to input to say, here's how, from your perspective, how the church staff member really won, or how the minister won. The other great thing for this is the fact that you can not only be sure that people know what they're accountable for, but you can make sure they have the resources necessary to do their job. So thinking back to the leadership development standpoint, it's an opportunity to say, are there leadership skills, competencies they need, specific skills that they need from a technical standpoint? So are there new areas perhaps around technology that we know this individual will need to really increase their skill set on in order to continue to exceed expectations? It also might be something where you take a step back and you might need to review your entire staff structure, where you look at what are the bodies of work that are being done, who's doing them, how well are they doing it, and is there perhaps a more effective way to structure in different ways that work could get done. So with all those pieces in mind, again, just really making sure you've got clear job descriptions, clear responsibilities that people have, and make sure you're revisiting that so people know how they can really win and exceed the expectations, because ultimately we know people want to do their jobs well, and it's making sure that they're equipped to do that.
Sarah, that's great. And it's just a great reminder, too, that when we look at employee engagement, there's so much that goes into it, right? We talk about employee engagement. We talk about leadership development. We talk about establishing clear goals. It's one thing to talk about it, but to really put those into action and create a plan for that, it takes a lot of thought. It takes more than just one conversation at a time, So there's a lot behind it. That's great. Well, hey, that takes us to our fifth and final major finding from the Next Level Teams report. And this one, to me, if there's anything that reminds me why all of this is so important, it's this fifth finding that kind of shows the value of creating a Next Level team, and really the mandate that we as church leaders have at creating that, and the need that exist for us to be intentional about that. And what we did, we asked employees basically, how open are you to changing jobs? We basically said, how open are you to considering opportunities with another organization? And we were surprised at the level of commitment that we saw across the board in churches. And what we saw was this. We saw that 1 in 2 staff members is currently open to new employment. Now, that does not include lead pastors. 1 in 2 staff members, 51% of people who are leading in a staff position outside of being the lead pastor is open to considering a new position, which that to us just was surprising, the level of loyalty that exists or at times may not exist there among church staffs. The second piece of this was equally, if not more shocking, that 1 in 4 lead pastors is also open to new employment. And you would love to think that the lead pastor, as the head of the organization, is owning it and is committed and it doesn't see another opportunity or another option. But we saw 1 in 4 lead pastors being open to new employment, and 1 in 2 staff members, 1 in 2 staff members being open to new employment as well. And William, you're working with a lot of individuals who are looking at different opportunities, and you're looking at or working with a lot of churches that are considering new hires. What have you seen there? What about this, or what may be some reasons behind this level of engagement that we're seeing at churches?
It's such a great question and timely. I know this webinar will get played a lot of different times of year, but Sarah's mentioned, it's January, and that's January is when everybody's going to lose 10 pounds and balance their checkbook and get right with Jesus and take a dream job.
Right.
It's the time of year where people are assessing their staff, and we're getting calls saying, hey, that student pastor we've had, can you help him understand a new destiny? Or we're getting people who are saying, I've been doing this over and over and over. I've been saying I need to do something more bold. I want to go plant a church. I want to go XYZ. It's the month of bold moves. And so it's a very timely topic for a lot of people viewing out there. If you don't like your job, you're normal. It's just a fact. If you look at any job market, any sector in the corporate world or the nonprofit world, and you're going to find across the U.S. job market last year, it depends on which study you read, but something between 50 and 60% of everybody says, I really don't like my job. And to think that doesn't somehow transfer into the church world is pretty naive. Now, what's staggering to me about the report is you guys are looking at openness to moving, we'll call it that instead of job dissatisfaction, or sensing my season might be coming to a close, which is often also tied to prison sentences. But people who feel like their season might be coming to a close, you're dealing with people in churches where the average church in your survey is growing 10% a year. That's not average.
Right.
The average church in America is sitting still at best. So when you look at employee engagement and how you keep people, you're dealing with the best of the best, and you've still got that number. I think the one word that I haven't heard today that every one of us knows, and you guys can speak to it just very, very well, but I see it in all the churches we work with, is culture. And if a culture of a workplace is good, people will withstand bad strategy. They'll withstand people they don't really care for. If the culture is good, culture trumps everything. I know Peter Drucker's line has been repeated so many times, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so what we're doing in our company, as we have just a ton of millennials, I'm the old guy around here, is setting up a culture that really is not William and the leadership team go off on the mountain, but it's really, okay, when we're functioning our best, what is it about this place that makes it function right? And then we're memorializing that, and we're turning it into pretty much a code for living. And we're taking a lead from some of the clients that we're seeing. Churches are actually doing this, but in our company, we pay a base salary, and then we pay a bonus based on company performance and personal performance. But your performance review is measured against how you're living out our core values, and far less about whether you made a number. We're maybe counter to it. Maybe we're unhealthy and need to call you guys to come in, but we don't have a lot of, here's the number of searches you need to do, the number of candidates you need to find, the number of calls you need to make. It's more about how are you living out our 9 core values, and can you show that they're being lived out every day? And so, one cool little trick, a great book for people to read from the corporate world that really hammers this is called The New Gold Standard. It's written by the management team at the Ritz-Carlton. And yes, if you're in church work, you can read something about the Ritz-Carlton and not be sinning. It's okay. It is a wonderful book by this team that is maybe better than anyone I know at delivering a consistently excellent customer experience. And it all drives back to how they live out their culture. And just sort of the thumbnail of the book, every day, teams break up, whether that's in the C-suite or the sous chefs in the kitchen. At every Ritz-Carlton, top to bottom, they break up once a day for a quick standing meeting of 8 to 10 minutes where one person is tasked in each of the teams with saying, today I saw the value of blank lived out when this happened. And they know their code. And so I'd suggest really focusing on culture. If you can get the culture right, you'll find people will stick around. You got to pay them well. You can't let people live on a missionary salary. A lot of fast-growing churches, honestly, Ryan, just don't pay well. They think, oh, man, you're getting to work in a really fast-growing church, and so you ought to be in it for the mission. And we service a lot of the fastest-growing churches in the country, and we have a very common talk with them where usually they're first-generation church. The founder planted it, and they're growing quickly. And we have to have the talk with them where we say, guys, it's time to move out of the frat house and into a real house. And that means you're going to have to pay real salaries. So you've got to do that. You've got to give measurable goals. But I think above all, culture trumps everything when it comes to retaining staff.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. So we've kind of overviewed a lot, Tony. We've looked at 5 of our biggest findings from the Next Level Teams report. Just so everyone knows, this report, if you're attending today, you'll get access to this report today, and it will go public tomorrow as well and can be shared there. But Tony, that's kind of an overview of what we've seen in the Next Level Teams report.
Well, and you're right, Ryan. We do want to reward folks that have participated on the webinar today. So you're going to get first access to all the findings. And Ryan, I want to ask you a couple of questions or more detailed about who participated. I want to ask you about that in a moment.
Sure.
We'll also send you a link so that you can review the webinar again. And the great thing is both William and the Vanderbloemen Search Group, they're ready to serve your team and help you if you need to find staff to fill key leadership roles. At the Unstuck Group, we're helping to address several of these areas as well when it comes to determining, are we healthy or not? Do we have a strategic plan where we can clearly align the wins and the expectations with our staff with what we're trying to accomplish as a church? And then one of the key things we help churches with is just looking at their staffing and their structure. We don't find the leaders like Vanderbloemen Search Group does, but we do help you structure for health and for growth. And so we'd love to help you do that. And what we're going to be including in the email you receive is a special offer to help you take that step. Now, Ryan, as I mentioned, we're getting a number of questions that have come in. Several of them are asking about the types of churches that participated. And I won't ask you to go into all the details that we also include in the report, but can you give us some sense? Are these small churches, big churches? Where do they come from?
Absolutely. I was skimming those questions and I saw several about how large are these churches? Does it apply across the board? Yeah, we saw churches from as small as less than 100 to as large as 24,000 respond to this survey. And it was actually a pretty big cross section. I'll actually give you the breakdown real quickly. 36% of the churches, or about a third of the churches, were under 500. And then from there, 25% of them were 500 to 999. So right in that 500 to just about 1,000 range. That was a quarter of the data. Another quarter of the data was in that 1,000 to 3,000 range. And then the last 12% were 3,000 plus. So you're seeing a third of the churches, less than 500, about 50% of the churches, so the bulk of it being that 500 to 3,000 in attendance range, and that remaining 12% being 3,000 plus. So again, a pretty wide cross-section, and that breakdown is in the report, but a pretty wide cross-section there of churches of a variety of sizes participating in the survey.
Yeah. A couple of the questions that came in were talking about the priorities as far as at different sizes of the church. What staff leadership should we be looking for? William, in a moment, I want to ask you about larger churches and what you're seeing as far as trends there. But really with smaller churches, my coaching's this. You really need to have a teacher because preaching is still pretty key to what happens in the church. And related to that, worship. And of course, that doesn't, in a smaller church, that doesn't necessarily need to be a full-time role, but you need to have someone leading the worship, the kind of the creative elements that are supporting the message. The next two priorities may surprise you, though, because it's after this I see a lot of churches hiring special, men's or women's ministry type roles, or youth pastors, or different leaders over different affinity groups in the church. But the two key priorities I see for churches that are smaller and trying to bump up against that 200 or 300 barrier are children's pastors first, and then we like to call it a pastor of connections, somebody that's helping folks take their next steps beyond the Sunday service. And so this would be taking next steps into membership, or into a small group, or into a Sunday school class, or into serving opportunities. If the teacher, if the senior pastor and the worship pastor are about Sundays, this pastor of connections would be about all those next steps that happen after that. And again, depending on the size of your church, these may not be full-time roles. They could be part-time roles initially. And even if you can't afford to pay anybody at this point, I would encourage you to look at your volunteer staffing structure and try to prioritize those leadership roles. William, when it comes to larger churches, let's say in the maybe 1,000 to 2,000 range, what are some of the priority leadership roles you're seeing churches hire when they get to that step?
That's a great question. Before I go there, just reinforce what you've said, Tony. Such good advice. And if I could put highlighter pen on one of those pieces, it would be the children's pastor. Mm-hmm. And if you are over 100 in worship, you're one of the larger churches in America. Mm-hmm. 100 is about average. So don't go thinking we're small, we can't have a children's pastor. A friend of mine who's pastor of 20 or 30,000 person church, we've been around a long time, told me, William, I decided a long time ago, I'm going to pay my children's pastor better than anybody on staff except the senior pastor and exec. And because they grow the church. If you're looking at it from a purely business standpoint, they pay for themselves. They bring in people, and that grows your church. And if they can recruit volunteers, they're going to recruit highly engaged people who tend to have better giving patterns, who tend to be healthier members. So if you find a good children's pastor, do not tell me about them. And I would also just say there's been a major shift in children's ministry in the last 20 years as we've seen large group, small group evolve, and we're no longer just hiring the school teacher who's willing to walk away from school and teach classrooms. And the pipeline for development of competent children's pastors in these areas is much shorter than the need. We do not have enough of them. There really is a talent shortage. So if you find a good one, equip them, resource them, send them to conferences, do whatever you have to do to keep them. And I would say in the larger church world, we're seeing that as a persistent need. I tried to quit doing children's pastor searches because they're the hardest ones to do. Frankly, we lose money on them nearly every time, and I lose hair every time. And I don't want to go super charismatic, but really had kind of a prayer meeting with Jesus where he was like, "Look, I said, let the little children come to me." So we're under orders to keep doing that, and we just see even the largest churches in the world call us saying, "Oh my gosh, I need a children's pastor." That is a very pressing need. I think some of the more specialized roles that you see, which I would encourage churches that are more normal, 1,000 to 3,000 is pretty abnormal. Mm-hmm. But you could take these roles and turn them into a volunteer role or even a college intern role where you're not paying as much but getting it done. Take that connections pastor and spread it out to social media connections. So like in the corporate world, one of the fastest growing sectors right now is the chief communications officer. So they get the CEO, the CFO, the COO. The CCO is a relatively new job, and it's a direct outgrowth of the dawning of the internet. I mean, we have as a church, Tony and I've done a bunch of teaching things together. He's heard me say this, but the church, the one place we really get it right historically is when there's a communication breakthrough, the church latches onto it, God blesses, and there's a major breakthrough. Whether it was Rome building roads and then Paul plants churches, or Alexander takes over the world and there's one common Greek language, and so then the New Testament's canonized, or there's the printing press is invented and Martin Luther puts a Bible in everybody's hands, and then Al Gore invents the internet, and here we go. So leveraging that like never before will make a huge difference. Community Bible Church in San Antonio, the biggest church you've never heard of. A lot of it is through their online church with Nils Smith. The Central Church Christian in Las Vegas pours a ton of time into their online church platform. And that's not just having a service, that's having chat rooms, that's having host pastors. So there are all sorts of cues you can take from the larger churches that are able to staff for that and say, how can we build a volunteer team that can own that? And frankly, your best volunteer team for that kind of thing is probably an average age of about 13 or 14 years old. They're around, and they know how to use the tools better than you do. I would say another key finding for me in large churches is, and it sort of goes to your lean staff, is that churches are spending more money. In other words, they're paying bigger salaries for fewer people. Mm-hmm. So they would rather find a leader of leaders and then figure out whether they're doing youth or children's or women's or whatever. If they can lead leaders, they can do just about anything. The only real specialty roles are that preaching and worship piece. But beyond those two, find a leader who can lead leaders and pay them what you got to pay them to get them and keep them. And you won't need as many staff people along the way.
That's great. Sarah, I'm going to put you on the spot with this question. We had a number of questions related to the conversation about leadership development. And I want you to think back to your time in the marketplace and then compare it to what you see with the churches that you're working with right now. And I would like you to share what are you seeing as far as leadership development in the marketplace and how that looks different from how you see leadership development occurring in the church?
Sure. Well, thinking back to my experience, one of the things that was typically really key is to really define what leadership characteristics you want people to exhibit. So do you want them to be really well-versed in strategy development? Do you want them to be well-versed in how to energize and inspire people? But in the marketplace, we had 6 or 7 really key things that we anticipated re-looking at every probably 5 to 8 years just to make sure they were still relevant to the organization. And those are the pieces that we built our programs around: training courses, experiences, assessment tools, as well as looking at then how we were hiring people as well against those leadership competencies. Because to William's point, we were as much concerned about what kind of a leader they were going to be as we were about their technical competence, because often the technical competence pieces were much easier to train than leadership pieces. So for those innate things, we have not seen as much of that I haven't seen as much in the church the last year that I've been involved with the Unstuck group. However, I am starting to hear more about that, where people are saying, this is what I want a leader to look like. They're really defining, what does it look like? And I think that there are some constant things that you can pull when you're looking across the board at great things, either whether it's in the marketplace or in church literature, where you're looking at even things like the Catalyst movement and some of those pieces where there's some great opportunities to equip your staff against really what you're going to define as your end game and what it looks like to be a leader in your organization. Again, so I would define a couple of key things and then look at across the board how you're going to do that. So is it equipping? Is it clear communication? Is it developing a strategy? Is it along the executional lines? And I would encourage you to think about leaders as people who are executing not just today, but people who are really prepared to build your organization for the future and build into people who are then going to be investing for the future of your organization.
Very good. Sarah, William, you brought up the topic of compensation, and there are several questions to help us figure out how are we compensating staff appropriately. And there are a few places you can go for some general salary comparisons. I know the Leadership Network does some work every couple years. They release a report. You can go to leadnet.org to see what they have available. This is for larger churches. They're doing comparisons. Within denominations, you can find typically comparison data available. I know Lifeway does this work for Southern Baptist churches. The National Association of Church and Business Administrators put together a survey. The challenge with all of that, William, though, is rarely are you comparing apples to apples. And because of that, I know the Vanderbloemen Search Group also provides a service to churches related to this. Do you want to share that?
Sure. In fact, we partnered with Leadership Network to just put out their newest, I think it's the largest study they've ever done, and it's really cool. It's a free download at leadnet.org. It's not very transferable to a church that's under 1,000 people. and it's not nearly granular enough to really know, okay, what do I need to be paying? And at the end of the day, the rock bottom line is you need to be asking as a leader this question: what would it cost me to replace Tony if he left today? What would it cost me to replace Sarah if she, left, got hit by a bus, decided she didn't want to work anymore? People don't think in those terms. They just think, well, what have we been paying them? Do we need to pay them a little bit more? And the church is so incredibly different from place to place. Some places have, we're seeing a rise in churches in expensive cities that are actually owning homes again, like the old parsonages from 100 years ago. That's actually happening again. That affects compensation. Do you do a car allowance? We just did a compensation study for a church in the middle of a city where they didn't have a car allowance, but they needed a metro rail allowance. So it really is highly contextual. If you have questions about that, feel free to contact us. The quickest way is to go to vanderbloemen.com. On the off chance that you can't spell Vanderbloemen right out of the box, you can go to findourleader.com. You can go to westaffthechurch.com. I have a person in charge of this that I need to get in a recovery group. He keeps buying domain names, but westaffthechurch.com will get you where you need to be, and we can visit with you about that.
Very good. William, first of all, let me just say thank you again for joining us today. Ryan, Sarah, you're great teammates. I love serving beside you, and you've done good work on this survey. And for the couple hundred people that have joined us today, we really do appreciate the opportunity to start this conversation. We think the report that you'll be getting in your inbox in the next day or two here, we hope that it really helps you have some great conversations with your leadership teams to talk about how your team is staffed and structured right now, and how you're prioritizing, how you're using your people resources. Because at the end of the day, we really do want your church to be unstuck. We want you to have a great impact in the communities you're serving. We want more people to come to know Jesus and get on mission with him. So thank you for joining us today, and watch your inbox for that email message that will have the link to the report and today's video and the special offer from the Unstuck group. Thank you again for joining us today.